were asked an Italian to try to speak with the hands in the back. It is very difficult, at least for me, I would not be able to do it. That is because I love using my hands in order to talk, to communicate. It's part of my culture, as well as part of who I am. Now imagine that my hand was replaced by a robotic hand, in this case a wearable device. Well, of course, there will be many tasks that this hand will have to fulfill. But the moment in which I will say this hand is really successful is when it will start moving the same way I'm doing now while I'm talking. In that moment, I would say that the hand is perceived as a natural extension of my body, and so I will have fully embodied my wearable robot. Of course, there are several steps in order to reach these goals, and there are also several fields that can be tackled. That can be the field of aesthetics, so how this device looks, comfort, so how it's perceived by the user, and control, so how it is moved in space. And my work focuses on the control side. And in particular, what I work on is to develop mathematical techniques in order to have better representations of how the human behaves, and that can be used to gain a better control of wearable devices. So when I talk of wearable robots, I'm mostly focusing on lower limbs, so legs robots, but the same concepts apply. And these are devices that are used in order to aid or restore activities such as walking. And these devices can be broadly classified as prostheses that are placed in case of an amputation and so are placed in series to a residual limb. And then there are exoskeletons that are used in case of a leg that has some sort of impairments, and so are devices that are placed in parallel to a limb. Well, the main goal of these devices is to work in concert with the user intention. So if we were to derive a little bit of a working principle, very generic, of robots, how they work, we have a system that is a system of a user and an exoskeleton. And what we want is that this system behaves as a healthy individual. For this goal, we need to have representations and understanding of the robot and of the human. And for this, we can use models. And in specific, we can use models of the human. And models means we want to predict, understand what the human does. And we could do it by having representation of the muscles, the tendons, and all of the elements that compose a joint. But that is sometimes very difficult because our knowledge on the physiology and all of the processes that regulate the properties of a human is not exactly so developed yet, or there are a lot of assumptions behind it. So what we can do instead is to have these models based on data. And the techniques are called data-driven modeling. So this is a field that is a subfield, we can say, of system identification, and this is the field that my department focuses on. And I really would like you to understand better what data-driven modeling means. And in order to do that, I'm going to take you a few months back to Christmas time. Let's say that I have this beautiful present under the Christmas tree, but it's not Christmas yet, and I'm really curious. I want to know what is inside. So what I'm going to do is what everyone will do. I'm going to do some data-driven modeling of this box. So I put it next to my ears, and I shake it. It's normal, no? So what I'm doing over here is I'm trying to apply a perturbation, a signal, a shaking to this box. And here, what is the output this box is producing. And this is exactly what data-driven modeling does. We start with a system, a black box. We don't know anything about it. In order to gather more information, we apply a perturbation, a signal or an input. And then we measure the output. So in this case, we would apply shaking again and measure the sound. That is the output. And then we want to have a model, a representation. And this usually is done in mathematical format. And what we do is we pick the mathematical function that best represents the relationship between the input and the output signal. In this case, it might be the mathematical function of a puzzle. So, for the application of humans modeling, of course, what is inside this black box is a leg or a joint. And what we want to do is obtain models from a mechanical point of view. So we take a leg, we want to estimate it, we're going to get a model. What we do? We shape it. So this means that we apply an input position perturbation that moves the leg. And we measure what is the resistance that this leg is applying in response. And this case is a torque signal, that is basically a force signal. And then the properties that represent the relationship between these two quantities is called human joint impedance. So this is a property that really describes how we can respond to changes in the environment. And this is a property that depends on several factors, such as the activation of our joints and of our muscles, actually. So if our muscles are really contracted, then we will see it will really be difficult to change the angle of a leg. And so there will be a very high resistance or a very high impedance. On the other hand, if we are relaxing our muscles, it will be very easy to apply perturbations. There will be very little response torque. And so in this case, we would say that we have a low impedance or we have a compliant joint. This representation can be interpreted mechanically as an inertia spring damper system. So we have a system in which we have an inertia that is basically the mass that has to be moved. In this case, it will be the mass of the shank and of the foot. And then we have a damping and a damper and a spring. And these are the properties that basically reflect the muscular properties, or actually also the passive properties of the structure that surround the joint, and say how much viscoelastic resistance we are posing. And so all of these structures together can be modeled as an inertia damping stiffness model. So here basically what is important is that we have parameters I, B, and K that represent the impedance of my system and that we want to estimate. And basically, if you want to really see what my work is about, is to find these values. Of course, this is not so easy. This is because joint impedance is time variant. So if we take a joint that is moving or a leg that is moving over time, and we apply twice the exact same input perturbation, we see that the output that we obtain in response will be different depending on the value of joint impedance. In fact, joint impedance depends on several values, such as fatigue. If we take a person who's running a marathon, maybe at the beginning of the marathon, it's going to be much more stiff than later on when it's really tired. Or, of course, another value is the activation level of the muscles. And we said before, a strong activation means very high spring constant. And then other values can be joint angle and many other factors, that all are factors that eventually change in time. And so the damping and the stiffness representing joint impedance are time varying. And so joint impedance changes in time. So if we get a model that will represent this property, we no longer have constant values. But we have functions that change in time. Over here we have B and K that are functions. And so this is very tough from identification point of view, because we have functions that create a high uncertainty. So this time variation creates that the number of unknowns that we want to estimate is extremely elevated. And this brings to a high uncertainty. So it means that when we want to estimate what is inside this box, we're not really sure, because the data are not enough to get us more information. So luckily, the level of uncertainty depends on the experiment that we are performing. So if we take, for instance, a case with no time variation, means a case where we have the angle that really doesn't change much, the activation level is more or less constant. And over there, we can see that the number of unknowns is limited. So the uncertainty is low, and system identification can be applied rather easily. This is the opposite with arbitrary time variations. Such beautiful activities that we perform are very hard to estimate because our properties change a lot. Over here, the uncertainty will be very high. And the unknowns, of course, will be high. What is usually done in the state of the art is to take activities that are periodic. Here we have a person that is doing over and over the exact same task as paddling, now with a certain periodicity. So we can assume that every period, the parameters change and repeat. So the number of unknowns that we have is not so elevated. And this means that we can use purely data-driven models to obtain a representation of the impedance. Well, if we want to move to activities that are more relevant to the human, such as walking, we see that, yes, sure, we have a person that walks step over step, so is doing a cyclic activity. But the problem is that humans are very bad at doing twice the exact same thing. So maybe one step will be one distance, and then the next step can be a bit longer. And so the properties are not exactly repeated, but they are quasi-periodic. And this means that we have a higher uncertainty. This can be the case also for other activities that are relevant for wearable robots, such as activities where we have a person that is interacting with an environment that changes in time. This can be, for instance, if we are outside and the wind is perturbing us, and then this is irrelevant because we want wearable devices that are robust. And also in this case, the uncertainty is high. So in order to develop methodology to obtain these estimates, we need to mix data with a priori information. And this is basically where my work focuses. So it's to develop methodologies that can be applied for this type of conditions and to test these methodologies on proof of concept simulation and experimental data. So I'm going to test the validity of these methodologies on some data from humans, which are easy to test and they're a bit simpler than these conditions. So now we can read the title again, hopefully getting a better understanding of what is it about. Data-driven modeling of human joint impedance towards better embodiment of wearable robots. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to present different methodologies that are the kernel-based regression, the sigmoid-based identification, and the combination with biomechanics. This technology, I'm going to briefly, but not too technically, explain them, and then I'm going to show you briefly how they can be applied on experimental data, and then give some take-home messages. The first methodology is the kernel-based regression, and has been applied to an emulated walking condition. So this is basically a condition where we want to reproduce the same time variation that we have during walking, but in a simplified way. So we have a person sitting down, and this person is asked to apply a torque with the foot that resembles the ankle torque during walking. With the task, this trajectory has a periodicity of 2 seconds. This means that we are reproducing slow walking. In the meantime, the person is attached to a device called the Achilles, and the foot is placed in a pedal. This pedal is shaking the foot, so it's applying position perturbations. Depending on the value of joint impedance, we have a resistance torque, and we've seen before in the example. In the meantime, the person was applying this voluntary torque that was superimposed. And the sum of these two signals is measured by sensors that are placed around the foot. So, to explain the methodology, I would like to go back to our Christmas edition. We have a system we want to estimate, and as I said before, it's not enough to only have data. We want to add a priori information. Such information can come from information in the past. We can think, okay, what was the previous Christmases, the present that I received? And so this can give statistical information on the type of present you're expecting. So we can see, okay, maybe I got once electronics, twice I got makeup, I got many times puzzles, and other times I got clothing or board games. All this information can provide a statistical model of my expectation of the type of present. And this statistical model can be combined with the data to reduce the uncertainty of my estimate. So for our experiment with the human joint impedance, the a priori knowledge that we say refers to the type of the time and the statistical information of the time variation. So So for example, we say, what we know before is walking is periodic. So we say that the properties change over time periodically with a certain periodicity. But then we also want to state that this periodicity is not exact. So we want also to include some cycle-to-cycle variability of the properties. And all of this information are actually carried and all summarized by a kernel that I designed for this experiment that is called the global quasi-periodic kernel. So the information are exactly the same. We have peaks at a distance, and this distance gives the periodicity of the time variation. And then we have a distance between the main peak and the lower peaks. And this states what is the cycle-to-cycle variability. So we can now see, the methodology. Very briefly, we have a method and we have a model that we want to estimate. We feed it with a priori information that are carried out by means of kernel, and we feed it with data. And then basically mathematical information, mathematical techniques can mingle together all of this information to get an estimate of the model parameters. If you really want to have maybe more in the back, more information, what we more do is we minimize a cost function, and in the meantime we do a regularization where the time varying terms, so the damping, the stiffness, and the voluntary torque, are regularized by means of the kernel methods, the same as the serial box over there. So we can now look at the data. The input that was applied was a multi-sign. What it really matters about this signal is that the signal with a small amplitude, and it kind of looks like the shaking that I was doing before, and it looks very random to the person. Then we have the measured output, that is the torque of the person. And this looks like the superimposition of the response to the shaking and a large amplitude signal. And this has a periodicity of 2 seconds, give or take. And also over here we can see that the person was not doing exactly the same thing twice. So this signal changes from one period to another. We can split the result into multiple segments and then put them all together in the same time axis, where the time axis is normalized as gate cycle percentage. So it means it goes from 0 to 2 seconds every time. And the first value that is estimated is the voluntary torque. So this is a value that represents the activation level of our muscles. And these results really show, as we were expecting, that the person was contracting and relaxing as a function of time. What is more interesting is to see the results of the damping and of the stiffness. And these values are profiled and really looks like the voluntary torque, and also show peaks that are really correspondent to the peaks of the voluntary torque. What does it mean? It means that the activation level was such that when it was maximum, we would have also maximum damping and maximum stiffness. Of course, there are many other results and also validations of this methodology. But what I wanted to show you is the potential of this methodology to obtain estimates of the time-varying parameters composing joint impedance, where we can have a shape that really is sound and really represents what we are expecting, even if the a priori information that we put were not so many. Oh, I also see this. So, just to conclude, this methodology is a methodology that can be applied to estimate cyclic activities, and where the a priori information are given by means of statistical model, and this can be used to obtain profiles of relevant information for joint impedance that can be tracked in the design of wearable devices. We can now move to the second method. Just needed a moment of pause. And this methodology is very different, and it's called the sigmoid-based identification. And this is basically shows how it's developed to see how a person can interact with an environment that is changing. This, for instance, as I was briefly mentioning before, can be applied to see how a person can change joint impedance to be stable also when we have wind or we are standing on a train. And so can be be also relevant for the design of wearable devices. In the experiment, we have a person that is sitting down and is holding with the hand a piston. And this piston is applying position perturbations, as I always say, shaking the hand. And the person is asked to try to minimize this displacement, so to try to keep the hand as still as possible. In the meantime, the piston was behaving as a virtual environment, and the damping was changing over time, such that the stability of the closed-loop system was jeopardized. And the human had to adjust in order to keep stability. So what we're interested in is getting models of the human. And the model is built from a position to a force. That means that is the model of an impedance. We can go back to our Christmas edition to get more what this methodology means. So we have also, of course, a priori information, and in this case, information on the type of present. Let's say that this Christmas we really wanted a type of present, so we're being very specific in our letter to Santa Claus. And we ask him that we want a puzzle. We ask him what is the size of the puzzle. All that is left to do in our estimate is just to get the number of puzzle pieces. So by adding a priori information, we have significantly decreased the uncertainty of our estimate. And this is the same we do for joint impedance identification. Over here, though, we impose from a priori the shape of the time variation. So what I use is a sigmoid. So I say that the damping and the stiffness change very smoothly over time, but also very rapidly. And this function is good to check when we have really to suddenly change to the environment that is changes. So this function has a very few parameters that are the amplitude, the smoothness, and the location of the center. And these are the very few parameters that we need to estimate with our methodology. So from identification point of view, then to find these parameters, we want to minimize a cost function. And this is a weighted cost function, but sadly is nonlinear. So this means that we have to find different, try different directions to find what is the minimum. But what it really matters at the end, we find an estimate of the values that minimize this cost function. And these estimates are values of the mass, that is constant, and of the damping and the stiffness that are actually sigmoid function. What we do then is we use these sigmoids in order to get estimate of some functions that are usually used to analyze mechanical systems, which are the eigenfrequency and the damping ratio. What is just important to know over here is that the damping ratio is high. It means that we're really trying hard to absorb oscillations, so we're really trying hard to be stable. If the damping ratio is low, then we're relaxing a bit more. If we look at the results, we first can see what the environment was looking like. And the environmental damping was changing from a value that was undamped, so it means it was a very unstable environment, to a value that it was very stable, so it allowed us to relax. And looking at the results, I'm showing you the damping ratio estimate. The results are going to appear in a second, but what is important over here, that whenever there is the peak red background, it means that we had an undamped environment. So it was a difficult condition. And what we see is that the human adjusts to this. So whenever the damping of the environment is low, the damping of the human is high. And so really this shows how the person can adjust in order to have stability when the environment is not giving it. And this can be used to check further how the human adjusted to sudden changes. So to summarize this methodology where the a priori information were imposed by means of a sigmoid, where a lot of information were given, reducing the uncertainty. And this can be used, for instance, I said it many times, I think, when we interact with an environment that changes. I need a second break before the last methodology. We're almost there. Combination and collaboration that is done with University of Twente maybe is there with Pablo Kopp and Massimo Sartori. And this comes from a position paper where we really stress the importance of unifying data-driven techniques with biomechanical formulations. So what we see is that in the literature there are a lot of different articles and different techniques that are there to estimate human joint impedance. These techniques can be put on a white box to black box once. When we are on the white box side, it means that we have scientists or people that really know a lot about the human body. So what they do, they take information on the muscles, on the tendons, on the tissues. You still see there? Oh, it just disappeared there. And they take information on the muscles and use that in order to build from the bottom to the top, so from the tendon to the joint level, an estimate of the stiffness and of the impedance. These methodologies are very good because they really provide a physiological insight of what's going on at a muscular level. But they're based on several assumptions, and not always these assumptions can be validated against data. On the other hand, we have the system identification people that use and start from data, from perturbations, in order to get models of the system. And these methodologies use simple model, or at least more simple representation that are given at the joint level. But the problem is that it's much harder to interpret the results. So what we say is just makes sense to take methodologies from one side and the other side of the spectrum and bridge them together. And the bridging can be done on a methodological point of view, but also in a dictionary point of view, because people very often don't speak the same language. So this means that for system identification side, what we say is that we can use some superpower magic, some extra sensors, to see what is inside our box to get a better grasping of the model. And I'm just going to give you one slide in order to explain this methodology and this combination. So we start with the foot. And what we do in system identification is that we apply perturbation, we measure the output, hopefully you already learned all of this, and we build a model. And with this model, we can get estimates of the stiffness of the joint and of the impedance. What is done on a biomechanical technique point of view is that they use different sensors, such as sensors on the activation level of the muscles or on the joint angle. And these sensors are split down in smaller signals at the muscle level, and these signals are used into model of the muscles and of the tendons, and these models are eventually combined together again at the joint level to get estimates of the damping and the stiffness and of the voluntary torque. So these are very different methodology, but they're all based on the same subject, that is the ankle and the ankle properties, and they all get an estimate of the stiffness. So what we say generically is that it makes sense to combine the estimates together and use the estimates from the system identification point of view in order to improve the parameters from the biomechanical side. So this means that we can really put together under the same vocabulary techniques that come from one side and the other, because there is a lot of potential for cross-fertilization. Biomechanics can really benefit from the system identification because it can provide an empirical validation of the models that are obtained, so validation against data. System identification instead can get a better prior knowledge that we have seen is very important to build better models and to have a lower uncertainty of our estimates. Altogether, it actually, hopefully, can be used to design better bio-inspired controlled wearable devices. So, what we've seen with our Christmas edition is that we can really combine together a priori information by means of statistics, known structure, or extra sensors combined together with data in order to obtain an estimate of a system that is not known, so a dark gray box. And in particular, we have seen how these technologies and methodologies can be applied to estimate human joint impedance. Human jet impedance, as we have all seen, is a property that can be described mechanically by an inertia damping spring system. And this representation can be estimated with data-driven techniques that can be applied for conditions in which we change with an environment or in which we have a cyclic behavior, such as walking, and can be used really to get a better grasping of what's the parameters over time, and these values can be fed to the design of wearable devices. Of course, now I've just looked at a very simple proof of concept methodology, no, not methodology, but application of the methodology. And the next step would be to move towards the identification of more complex activities, such as walking, or maybe, who knows, it can be identifying how the human moves and the Italian moves as a function of time. So to really conclude my talk, I would like to stress that in my PhD, I really put a lot of effort to try to go around. Many people are here, some are following online, and to go and try to build, establish collaboration with departments and researchers that do the same thing, because there is a lot of lack of communication at times, and expressing the same concept with the same terminology at times can really help getting to a better understanding. So I really believe in the collaboration between caretakers, patients, and researchers that all speak a different language, but eventually all share the same goal. Thank you.